Hello everyone, and welcome to episode 44, Remastered. If you're fresh off of the previous episode, which explored the marine biome of the open ocean, then you heard that today's episode will be moving closer towards the shore, towards dry land. But first we'll have to cross the wetlands. We'll have to cross into swamp and marsh, and move alongside rivers and lakes and inland seas. So today's episode will kind of be like an audiobook about an explorer who's washed up on a beach, and he wakes up to see a river flowing from deeper inland. He follows the river and traces it back to its lake source. And as this explorer makes this journey along the river, going from the coast to an inland sea or a large lake, he will stop and study all of the life that he sees. It should be a fun adventure, transitioning from the open ocean to more terrestrial biomes. The wetlands and the lakes are like an intermediate biome between water and land, where the ocean is all water, and the land is, well, all land. Your typical wetland, river, and lake is some combined permutation of geography and a vast amount of water. Various aspects of marine and terrestrial biomes can be found in wetlands and waterways, and they involve interactions from both marine and terrestrial species. These wetlands tend to be very fertile habitats, with extremely high biodiversity and ecological significance. Alright, so with that said, let's get started. Our theoretical explorer finds himself washed up on a beach, and he begins the exploration of life in the various waterways that shape the geography of the planet that he sees before him. The first biome that he notices that he is standing upon is the shore, or the coastline, where the sea breaks upon solid land. In almost all of the world's coastal areas, marine life thrives in the shallow water that's just off the dry coast. The sunlight illuminates the shallow ocean floor, and this can support a variety of photosynthetic life. Any large rocks near the water might be coated in green algae, while the submerged areas are quite likely to be covered in kelp beds. And if the explorer goes to look at the tide pools, he would see clams, sea urchins, sea cucumbers, and all manner of crabs. Now, the kelp beds in particular are pretty interesting. They're very ecologically important. I talked about them a bit in the previous episode, but to kind of retouch on it, the kelp beds are like miniature forests. Their growth ceiling is basically the surface of the ocean, and this creates a canopy of sorts, much like a terrestrial forest. When you get near the coast, the water is pretty shallow, and so this growth ceiling is really close to the ocean floor, and the result is that you have a large number of thin, short kelp, and this creates an almost fluffy, loose carpeting that provides a food source for numerous herbivores. There's also species of seagrasses, which are just like regular grasses, regular carbon dioxide-breathing, autotrophic, photosynthetic plants, but these seagrasses live entirely underwater. These seagrasses live in coastal environments where they have ample, regular access to light. And then you have the species of tree that live partly submerged, and these are known collectively as a mangrove. Mangroves are common in tropical and subtropical areas, while seagrasses and kelp have a much larger range. All of these plants have a really neat ecological function. They sap energy from waves and currents, which slows down the water and makes the waves break more gently across the shore. This will slow water-based erosion on the rocks and the coastal geography, and this will keep these habitats a little more physically stable for a longer period of time. The areas like these kelp beds, mangroves, and the meadows of seagrass are very complex and diverse ecologies. Marine animals love these places, like smaller species of fish and mollusk, that can live and reproduce under the protection of the vegetation. For example, the roots of a group of mangrove trees can provide an almost perfect form of protection for smaller fish, which live among the roots and they swim through them like a maze. while larger fish, the ones that might eat the smaller fish, can't make it through these tight, confined, root-bound corridors. Species of algae, fungus, and worms also thrive, especially in seagrass. And more than that, all of these vegetables are an important and vital food source for hundreds of larger species. The seagrass is like an ubiquitous food source that marine species from across the world can agree on. It's consumed by large mammals like dugongs and manatees, it's consumed by reptiles like turtles, and it's consumed by numerous species of bird that float or live by coastal waters. It's also consumed by crustaceans like crabs and prawns, and of course, a huge range of fish. These herbivorous fish go on to feed carnivorous fish and/or carnivorous or omnivorous birds, which live in nests on the dry land, which are on or near the coast. They're also eaten by carnivorous sea-bound animals like whales, dolphins, sharks, and seals. These animals interact with each other, creating another layer of complexity to the coastal ecosystem. Sharks like to eat seals, killer whales like to eat sharks, and humans have hunted and eaten all of them. Humans are definitely an influential part of the coastal environment, and we've been greatly influencing coastal biomes for literally thousands of years. The moment the first proto-humanoid reached into a lagoon or shallow water reef to catch a fish, our influence on the ecosystem has evolved into fishing towns, into commercial fishing, and industrial-scale contamination with everything from bits of plastic to nuclear waste. Although our influence has been relatively short on an evolutionary timescale, and life simply hasn't had the time to make any major evolutionary responses to human input. The most obvious influence we've had, in an evolutionary sense, is by putting a huge bottleneck on the populations of fishable species. Overfishing is a serious problem. Something like 90% of the species of fish in the ocean are being fished at capacity or at overcapacity. And a lot of the key commercial fish species have had damn near every single large individual fished out, which leaves only the small ones left behind to breed. And so species as a whole are experiencing a very strong selective pressure to become smaller. And that's because of us. Now, as our explorer moves along the coast, he begins to see some drier coastal habitat. Some of these drier coastal habitats begin to look like salt marshes, which are characterized by dense patches or clumps of vegetation, like reeds and grasses, that are growing out of a very salty, watery, marshy field. These plants are all halophytes, which means that they're salt tolerant. This quality is an obvious necessity for life in a salt marsh habitat, because it gets regularly flooded by the tide, and so there's seawater that regularly replenishes the habitat. The plants here live off the tide in an interesting way. When the surge of water comes from the ocean and breaks against the land, it's pushing a lot of loose sand and uplifted sediment onto the shore. These plants and their dense, sturdy roots are able to break up the force of the tide waves, which lets the nutrients and all of the sediment fall out of the current and come and settle to the ground. The nutrients will then feed the halophyte plants through their roots, and they also feed a host of other organisms like crabs and small fish and algae that also live in the salty habitat. So a salt marsh is a marsh. A marsh is a wetland that's dominated by herbaceous plants, or plants that don't have permanent woody tissue above their roots. Just like in the salt marsh, this includes various species of reeds, sedges, and grasses, as well as the occasional woody plant that's usually no more than a small shrub or a bush. Marshes are consistently described as an intermediate landscape, or a transitional landscape, because the marsh includes the area with all of the smaller, softer plants that are growing out of the seafloor, growing out of the water, but before you get to the larger, woodier plants that are deeper onto solid, dry land. The salt marshes exist in the coastal areas between land and ocean, where saltwater currents bring sediment and nutrients that settles and feeds all kinds of salt-tolerant plants and other organisms. A freshwater marsh, on the other hand, exists along the edges of lakes and rivers. These get flooded when rainwater or river runoff causes the water level to rise, which will submerge the closest herbaceous plants while watering the plants at higher ground. So, where marshes are defined by the presence of soft herbaceous plants, a swamp is defined by the presence of woody trees and woody forests. Swamps typically exist along the floodplains of a river that cuts through some kind of rainforest. Some of the largest swamps in the world exist where the Amazon rainforest meets the Amazon River. The Everglades in North America is a massive swamp, as are the bayous of the southern floodplain region of the Mississippi River. The Tigris and the Euphrates rivers, feeding through Mesopotamia and southern Iraq, has a large swamp. Western Siberia is just a giant floodplain that has terrible drainage, and this has created massive, sprawling swamps like the Vasugan. There's another kind of swamp, a more specific kind of habitat, called a bog, which is kind of like the swamp of the north. Bogs are defined by the relatively high water acidity, their low mineral content, and the characteristic carpet of sphagnum moss that grows on a thick layer of peat. Another major type of wetland is called a fen, which is kind of like a mix between a swamp and a bog. It has the woody vegetation of a swamp, but the peat and the low nutrients in the water that are more characteristic of a bog. Fens also tend to exist at mid to high range latitudes. So if our explorer happened to wash up on an ocean, then as he walked along the coast, the first new habitat he would see would be the salt marsh, with all of its herbaceous plants. And let's say that our explorer didn't want to try and struggle across this marsh. He didn't want to get wet, he didn't want to get stuck, he didn't want to step on something or get bit by something that's living in the water, so he decides to turn inland and walk away from the shore. If he's walking along the side of this saltwater marsh, he might notice after a while that it gets a little more swampy. He's starting to see more and more woody plants as he gets deeper and deeper inland, where the geographical features of the surface can support more larger organisms, like trees. As our explorer moves across these habitats, he thinks about them, he ponders their traits and their ecology. He notices that all these wetlands seem to be dependent on the floodwaters that come in and keep the land wet. As flooding is hugely influential and literally transformative for the physical environment, the frequency and the duration of the flooding determines many aspects about the wetland, which in turn influences what kinds of life can live there. Obviously, flooding will destroy smaller, weaker plants, especially faster flooding, more intense flooding. And it will also drown all of the burrowing mammals and lizards and insects that can't get out of the way. The flooding will push larger fauna out of the local ecology, like larger mammalian herbivores, and this will reduce the quantity of vegetation that's being consumed, and it will give plants a little respite. It'll give plants a chance to rebound and regrow their damaged tissues and be a little more bountiful. More flooding from the ocean means that more sediment and salt will be deposited on the ground, which may help or hinder the growth of other plants, depending on if the amount that gets deposited is just right or if it's way too much. Our explorer would also notice that wetlands are ideal habitats for amphibians, which are named after their amphibious nature. Parts of their life cycle take place on dry land, while other parts of their life cycle take place in the water. And in maturity, they can move about in both aquatic and terrestrial environments. The amphibians can thrive in the shallow, muddy water without being bothered too much by the relatively low oxygen content. After all, they can handle being out in the open air where oxygen is available at no cost, and they can breathe through their skin. The frogs, toads, newts, and salamanders that live in the wetlands consume pretty much everything that's smaller than them. They've evolved a simple mechanism for finding food. If they see movement, they make an attempt to catch and eat it. It's pretty straightforward. Amphibians have a relatively low metabolism, so their hunting is somewhat slow motion. For most of the time, the frog or salamander will be staying relatively still. It simply sits and waits for something to wander around it, something to come close into its field of vision, like a fly or a spider, an earthworm, or maybe even a small fish. Amphibians have many ecological functions, which are really important for the stability and the health of the habitat. For example, amphibians lay their eggs in the water, and when the larvae are born, the larvae will swim around and eat up algae. This top-down regulation will keep the algae in check. Otherwise, these populations of algae would grow rapidly in the swampy environment and consume all of the oxygen in the water, to the detriment of everything else that lives there. After the unchecked algae would use up all the oxygen for their own growth and respiration, the water will become anoxic. All the fish will die, and even the amphibians will struggle to survive. The presence of amphibians, and thus the presence of larvae in the water, means that this algae is kept in check, and at least that variable in the ecosystem is stabilized, so the algae won't grow out of control, eat up all the oxygen, and kill off everything else. That doesn't happen, in large part because of the amphibians. In turn, the numerous little amphibians that live in the wetlands will get preyed upon by larger animals. Wading birds like to stride through the reeds of a marsh and use their long beaks to pluck little frogs out from the water. Predatory reptiles, like snakes, will eat pretty much all amphibians they come across, and sometimes amphibians will cannibalize each other. So as our explorer is walking along the sides of these marshes and swamps, and thinking all about amphibians and the various fauna that live in these habitats, he begins to see streams of water coalesce into a river. And naturally, he becomes a little curious. And so our explorer decides to follow the river deeper inland. One of the first things he notices is that the wetlands near a river include habitats like floodplains and river deltas. During most of the year, a river has a relatively steady size, and it flows within well-defined riverbanks. But occasionally, when there's a heavy rainfall that inundates the ground with water, the river swells. The water level rises past the normal bank, and floods the nearby ground area. These flooded areas alongside a river are called floodplains, and these floodplains are capable of seasonally or temporarily sustaining complex ecosystems, which really depend on the burst of floodwater to bring in nutrients and to saturate the higher ground with water. During the dry season, or during periods with no flooding, this floodplain will often become quite dry and barren, with maybe a handful of dormant shrubs, some grasses, and maybe the occasional tree. But until the floods come, most of the landscape is it's too dry to sustain an ecosystem. Or I should say, it's too dry to sustain a complex ecosystem. But when the floodwater comes, plus all of the silt, sediment, and nutrients that it sweeps in, this enables an explosion in vegetation. Fast-growing hydrophilic plants quickly emerge, and the wet soil gets permeated with funguses and numerous species of bacteria and microbe. This wet, nutrient-rich soil becomes really fertile for life. River deltas are also inundated with water, and they also get flooded during heavy rains, so the lands get just as much nutrients and sediment as the floodplains, and a lot of the herbaceous plants that grow in the floodplains also grow in the delta. Although the delta, by virtue of being literally in the mouth of the river, tends to be flooded a little more often, and so the environment can be a little less stable, and so you're less likely to see a more complex ecosystem develop. Like, it's not very likely for you to see a complex, dense, long-lasting forest develop right there in the mouth of a river, right in the river delta. It's simply not going to happen because the habitat is a little too dynamic, and the forces of the regular river flooding coming through and sweeping across the river delta, it's just not conducive to these long-term, complex ecosystems. But the other wetland areas on either side of the river, these aren't literally in the mouth of the river, so they're not being quite as brutally eroded and quite as frequently flooded. But anyway, the hydrophilic plant growth in these floodplains and river deltas creates a physical habitat for amphibians and birds, and depending on the climate, reptiles. Little mammals, like rodents, may burrow into the ground that's been stabilized by root systems, while frogs and toads and salamanders will live in the wetter depressions. Alright, so at this point, our theoretical explorer has awoken on the beach. He's explored a marsh and a swamp, and then he walks along the floodplains of a river. If the explorer moves upriver by walking along the riverbank, he'll be walking through a type of biome called a Riparian Zone. This Riparian Zone is a unique kind of biome that exists along either side of a river, along the edges of the river, fed by the water and the constant stream of sediments that the river provides. Where the river feeds the plants in turn help shape the river. This is because the roots of trees and large, strong plants will keep the soil on the riverbanks together, which prevents washout from flooding, as well as creating hard points in the soil that the river, instead of flowing through and eroding, will instead flow around. All of these roots and stabilized clumps of soil will sap energy from the water as it flows across the landscape. The cumulative effect of this is that it'll slow the river's current and make it more likely for sediment to fall out and accumulate at the river's bottom. The vegetation in the riparian zone is thus influential on the shape and flow pattern of the river, and by making it easier for sediments to fall out of the current and accumulate on the river floor, that provides nutrients for all manner of organisms, including the plants themselves. This vegetation includes various species of herbaceous perennials, like sedge, rushes like bulrush and spike rush, ferns like wood ferns, sword ferns, and goldback ferns, various species of grasses, and a handful of flowering plants. Larger plants in the riparian zone include shrubs like willow, dogwood, and vine maple, as well as numerous species of berry-producing plant, like blackberries, snowberries, gooseberries, and raspberries. The riparian zone is also quite fertile for trees, like redwoods, willows, oak, aspen, maple, sycamore, cottonwood, and many others. I really don't think there's a tree species out there that doesn't mind living next to a river. Now, in some areas of the river, the water is slowed enough that there might be little pockets or offshoots of standing water. These places, where the water is a little calmer and a little more still, are like dense pockets of ecological activity. The small pool of still water is surrounded by plants, usually choked by trees and covered in grasses, reeds, and shrubs, to the point where if you're standing on the edge, you might not even be able to see the surface of the water itself, because it's so covered by all of this vegetation. The standing water also allows various species to lay their eggs, like insects, amphibians, and fish. The insects typically lay their eggs underwater, on or protected by some piece of submerged vegetation. These insect eggs will hatch, and the insect babies will crawl from the eggs to either swim in the water or fly or crawl around the plants on drier land. These insects provide a food base for the frogs, toads, salamanders, newts, and any reptiles that happen to be living nearby. The fish can feed on the insect eggs, as well as the amphibians' eggs, and the larvae, and the fish themselves lay their own eggs, and some species of fish will eat the eggs of other species of fish. There's a lot of egg eating going on. And yes, it's gnarly and pretty gruesome because, it's basically all these carnivores or omnivores just eating the little fetal babies of every other species. But I mean, a little egg is a nice discrete packet of nutrients. And if you're a wild creature living in a swamp somewhere, finding a nice little cluster of fresh eggs, you're not going to turn that down. That's a great meal. The fish that live in these rivers are diadromous, which means that they migrate between the freshwater river and the saltwater ocean at some point in their lives, as part of their development or reproductive cycle. You might have heard of some of the species of fish that will return from the ocean back to the river in which they were born, so that they can do what their parents did. They can go back upriver to the spawning grounds, they can try and spawn, and then they'll die. These are called anadromous fish. The most well-known is probably the salmon. The salmon will spawn in lagoons or still water runoff areas, and when the larvae are born, they spend a brief period of time eating algae and insects and growing, before they eventually grow large enough to migrate down the river and out into the ocean. Other species of fish migrate in the opposite direction, where they live their lives in the freshwater rivers before migrating out to the oceans to spawn. These are called catadromous fish, and the most commonly referenced catadromous fish seems to be a kind of eel from the genus Anguilla. The Amazon River is the largest river in the world, running through the largest tropical rainforests in the world, making it one of the most biodiverse regions on the planet. The Amazon River is packed with marine species like fish, crabs, prawns, and even turtles. There are thousands of species of fish that live and die in the river, including the huge, torpedo-shaped Arapaima fish. These things are really big, reaching nearly 10 feet or 3 meters in length, with long fins running down their back half, and a head and a jaw shaped like a scoop. They're a type of mouth brooder, which means that after their young are born, but before their young are strong enough to fend for themselves, the male fish will keep the offspring safe in his mouth. The female fish stays nearby to actively ward off predators and keep the male safe, so their little offspring can enjoy 2 levels of protection. These Arapaima fish are top predators in their river environment, swimming around and eating smaller fish, crabs and prawns. They'll even eat land animals that wander too close to the water's edge, with the Arapaima bursting out to grab the poor rodent or reptile or whatever it is and drag it back down under the water. The Amazon River is often muddy and oxygen poor, as are many of the oxbow lakes that are formed when deposited sediment redirects part of a river and leaves behind an isolated river fragment. The nearly anoxic conditions created an evolutionary pressure for better oxygen acquisition, and so the Arapaima and its cousin species like the pirarucu and the pasha adapted to breathe oxygen right out of the air like a mammal. They have fish gills, and they use them for a limited kind of aquatic respiration, but they're actually dependent on the air to satisfy their total oxygen needs. The Arapaima fish and relatives have a labyrinth organ which is filled with tiny blood vessels, and this highly vascularized organ is exposed to dry air when the fish opens its mouth out of the water. The air will diffuse into the veins, and this acts like a rudimentary lung to get oxygen into the fish's body. It's like a lung in the back of the fish's mouth. Recall that amphibians also thrive in these low-oxygen water systems, which is one of the reasons why the Amazon rainforest is home to thousands of species of frogs, salamanders, and all manner of other amphibians. Other predatory fish in the Amazon River include the silver arowana, which is like a smaller version of the Arapaima, and of course, the terrible piranha that gets featured so often in B-rated horror movies. Although there are several dozen species of piranha, only a few of them, only a small handful, have a taste for human flesh. In general, piranha are omnivorous fish. They forage on various plants when other food sources are rare, but they prefer to eat various marine bugs, like insects, and insects' eggs, worms, and other smaller crustaceans. Although piranha have this reputation for being ferocious, flesh-eating predators, this really isn't actually the case. Piranha are mostly foragers, or scavengers. In times of plenty, they'll eat plants, or any of the numerous insects, worms, spiders, slugs, and snails that grow on and around the plants. The piranha do form schools, or shoals, but these aren't typically formed for the purpose of group hunting. Instead, these larger groups form as a kind of defense against predators of their own. When you're looking at an individual, a typical individual piranha is a relatively small fish. It's vulnerable to being snatched up and eaten by any larger predator, like a dolphin or the Arapaima. When the piranha swim in large groups, they become much more intimidating. They not only seem larger, the individual fish are also harder to identify and track. The common trope about a horde of piranha descending on a cow or a person and stripping the flesh off their bones in mere seconds is largely an exaggerated myth. I mean, it's been known to happen, but it's actually very rare. It's much less rare than horror movies would have you believe. This kind of frenzied feeding behavior occurs in pretty rare circumstances, when the piranha are starving and they're being annoyed by some kind of disturbance. It's more likely than anything that a cow wading across a tributary would enrage a hungry school of piranha, but even that doesn't really happen too often. The piranha are actually rather shy and timid in the face of larger organisms. In that sense, they're a lot like vultures. They just want to stay on the sidelines, away from the major action and away from any big threats, so that they can come in and scavenge the leftovers after the larger predators have had their fill. So our theoretical explorer is moving upriver, observing all of the plants and animals in the Riparian Zone, and observing all of the fish and hydrophilic plants hanging out in the water. After following the river for some time, the explorer might eventually come to a lake or a pond. These are inland bodies of water that usually have a number of rivers that feed water in or drain water out. One of the most important features of lakes and ponds is their stillness. The water in a lake has a very weak current. It moves slowly, if it moves laterally at all. There is, however, quite a lot of vertical movement of water currents that are based on temperature, and this is vital for any animals and plants that might live in the lake. In the summer, the ample sunlight will warm the air, and both the sunlight and the warm air will subsequently warm the upper layers of the water. The deeper water in the lake or the pond isn't exposed to the sunlight or the warm air, and so it generally stays pretty cold and still at the bottom of the lake. The warm water at the shallower depths, at the top of the lake, sits above the persistent pocket of colder water. It sits above the thermocline, until the fall when the air temperature will gradually cool down. At this point, near the winter when the air temperature is cooling, the upper and lower layers of the lake have a near enough temperature that this thermocline dissolves and water circulates from top to bottom. This creates a cyclical effect called an upwelling, or lake turnover, which is a vertical current that sweeps nutrients from the lake bed up into the open water, where it feeds the plankton and plants and other organisms that might be near the surface. As the winter season progresses and the upper layers of the lake freeze over, another thermocline is established. The area immediately under the ice, or the area in closest proximity to the surface ice, is relatively cool. The water is a low temperature. But warmer water that was cycled down during the late fall will stay near the bottom. As winter ends and spring comes about, the ice will eventually melt and expose the surface water to the warming air. This dissolves the thermocline again and creates another upwelling event. In this way, seasonal temperature changes cause lakes to cyclically flush nutrients up into the open water for all of the organisms to feed off of, and this happens at least twice a year. Some of these nutrients feed the thriving bacterial communities that live in ponds and lakes. These bacteria form mats on the lake bed. They form biofilms on the rocks near the shoreline, and they float around in every cubic centimeter of the water. Phytoplankton live in the photic zones of the lake, where they can access sunlight to make energy, and there's also paraphytic algae, which lives on the sandy, muddy substrate of the lake bed. These microbial species are major oxygen producers, cycling carbon dioxide and feeding enough oxygen into the water to support larger organisms like fish and amphibians. The plants in a lake are often fast-growing and herbaceous. Because the fresh water is much denser than air, these aquatic plants don't need to invest that many resources in growing thick stems and a sturdy body structure. They don't need to support themselves because they naturally float in the water. Their natural buoyancy keeps them from falling over or sinking in the water. Some of these aquatic plants are rooted in the substrate at the bottom of the lake, while other plants are entirely free-floating. Some of them reach up to the surface of the water and emerge into the open air, while other plants live their whole lives and die entirely underwater. Feeding off of these plants are numerous fish and amphibians, as well as herbivorous reptiles like various lizards and turtles. While all of these primary consumers are munching on the aquatic plants, predatory animals can come in and hunt them down. These predators, these secondary consumers, include various species of carnivorous fish, as well as snakes and alligators. I want to take a minute to talk about alligators, because they're pretty hardcore predators that live in every biome that I've talked about today. And they're just super badass in general, and I want to talk about them, so there you go. The two extant species of alligators have a relatively small range, with one species living across the southeast and south-central US, and the other species living along the Yangtze River in China, although it's so endangered it's bordering on extinction. In the US, where the number of alligators is somewhere in the millions, alligators are really important apex predators and ecological regulators. When the alligator is first born, the tiny alligators practice their hunting skills by preying on fish and crabs and snails and other small pieces of meat like lizards and rodents. Naturally, they begin to attack larger prey as they themselves grow larger, and their meals begin to include larger fish, larger reptiles, and larger rodents. In fact, more aggressive or hungry alligators will even attack dogs and bears. The alligators are able to handle the violence and the power of these larger prey animals because they themselves are violence and power incarnate. The alligators have evolved a powerful, U-shaped mouth, which can bite down on prey with a crushing force of several thousand pounds. Interestingly, while the muscles that close the mouth are really, really strong, the muscles that open the mouth are relatively weak. They're so weak, in fact, that you or I could easily hold an alligator's mouth shut with our bare hands. A characteristic aspect of alligator predation is the so-called death roll. Because alligators have a slow metabolism, they have to find ways to maximize their effectiveness as hunters. They have to maximize the energy efficiency of hunting and killing prey. As a result of this evolutionary pressure, they've adapted to make sudden, rapid jerking motions to capture a prey animal before it even realizes what's going on. This is why, in documentaries, you'll often see alligators lying very still or floating in the river like a log. They want to lull animals into a false sense of security so that they can come close enough to snap out and bite at the prey. This death roll is a tactic used to kill larger prey that can't be killed with just a single bite. Stuff like a bird or a fish, if it's caught, it can be killed with the force of a single bite. But larger animals, like deer or bears, require a little more creativity to bring down. The alligator makes its attack. It strikes out with its jaws and clamps down on a limb or the neck or the tail of the prey animal. The animal is unable to escape. It can't get out of this terrifying grip of the alligator's jaws. But the alligator can't kill the animal without inflicting more damage. And it can't just open its jaws to make another bite, because in the moment that it lets go, the animal is going to run away and it's going to lose its meal. So instead of letting go to try and make another bite, the alligator will use its tail as a fulcrum to start spinning and twisting. The jaws aren't moving, they're not letting go. So when the 800-pound alligator starts twisting its whole body, the captured limb is going to start twisting too. Within moments, the alligator has rolled over several times, and it's twisted and ripped off the limb, causing catastrophic damage to the prey animal. With its limb ripped off, or its neck or belly ripped open, the animal is doomed and will eventually die. It's easy prey for the alligator, who can now conserve energy by just sitting back and waiting for the prey animal to bleed to death. Once dead, or once so maimed that it can't get away, the alligator moves in and begins to eat. Besides the fact that they're super awesome, I wanted to mention alligators because they live in almost every environment that I've talked about today. Alligators live along the coasts in Louisiana, Georgia, and Florida. They live in the swamps and marshes of those states, as well as the marshes and swamps all across the south-central United States. They live all along the riverbanks of the Mississippi River, and many others, and they hang out around freshwater lakes and ponds. alligators are right there next to the frog as symbols of the wetland biomes. And with that, I think I've covered just about everything that I wanted to talk about today. Our theoretical explorer has moved from the coastline, through marshes and swamps, up a river to a lake, making observations of the life that lives there at every step along the way. And what's kinda cool is that you, as the listener of this episode, are kind of like our theoretical explorer, as you followed my narration on this audio adventure across a typical wetland environment. If you like this episode, then hit the like button. And if you like all my content and want to catch the newest episodes about biomes, then hit the subscribe button. And as always, thanks for listening.